Welcome to Battleground, where we break down the people and places in the 7 swing states that will decide the 2024 presidential election. Night 1 of the DNC is in the books, and new polling from all 7 swing states shows just how quickly this race has changed, with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. We'll have a closer look at what the current electoral map reveals about the state of this race. Then, the change in face of voters in Georgia. How demographic shifts in the Peach State have made a once reliably red state decidedly more purple. And Tim Walz gets his close-up. The Democratic VP nominee addresses the DNC tomorrow night. Democrats are hopeful his message can resonate with voters in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. But can he? I'm Cupp, and with 76 days until this election, this is Battleground.
Selecting Kamala was the very first decision I made when I became our nominee. And it was the best decision I made my whole career. We've not only gotten to know each other, we've become close friends. She's tough, she's experienced, and she has enormous integrity.
President Biden speaking at the DNC Monday night, making the case for Kamala Harris to succeed him and become the first woman ever elected president of the United States. While Donald Trump spent Monday night here in Pennsylvania making his case for the state's 19 electoral votes. As we just mentioned, tomorrow night in Chicago, we'll hear from Tim Walz, and then it's Kamala Harris's turn on Thursday. For more on what's going on there at the DNC, we're joined again by Jason Calvi from Fox 6 News in Milwaukee. Yesterday, you showed us some of the early stages of protests there. What are you seeing on the ground today?
Pretty quiet so far. We do see a lot of police staging and on standby, but that is expected at one of these national special security events, including right here in Chicago. We saw the same in Milwaukee.
Jason, night 1 was long. It went an hour over time. President Biden didn't get to speak until 11:30 or so. What are you hearing about any plans to tighten up the program?
Well, we asked the Democratic Convention exactly what happened last night when it went over. President Biden speaking, stretching into midnight on the East Coast, and they said they blamed it on the applause. They said there was really a lot of applause interrupting the speakers, and that's why things were delayed last night. We'll see if they can get the show on schedule tonight when former President Barack Obama speaks. From
your perspective, being in the room, what are you hearing about last night's big speeches? Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. Did anyone steal the show?
Well, I was on the floor, and there was a lot of excitement in that arena. This is the home of the Chicago Bulls, the Chicago Blackhawks. We heard from former NBA champion and Olympic basketball coach Steve Kerr, and he really rallied the troops. He walked out to that fight song for the Chicago Bulls, really popular here in Chicago, but also a story that resonates across the country because, again, the Olympic basketball coach. So definitely think he was one of the highlights for the crowd here in Chicago, but also former Secretary of State and former Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton. She really got a lot of thunderous applause here in the arena. A lot of enthusiasm in this crowd here in Chicago last night.
And lastly, specifically for voters in your home of Wisconsin, what will they be looking for from Tim Walz tomorrow night?
Well, who exactly is Governor Walz? I know they're going to be talking about how he was from a farming family in Nebraska, really trying to cut into what Republicans have really gained in battleground states like Wisconsin, which is really getting a lot of votes from the rural community. So really speaking to those voters, Milwaukee County, we've seen turnout really sinking since Barack Obama was on the ballot back in 2012, a big shrink in voters in Milwaukee County. And so we're really seeing how former President Barack Obama is going to be speaking to those people tonight here at the United Center in Chicago.
Jason Calvi with Fox 6 News Milwaukee, reporting for us from Chicago all week. Jason, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Battleground, we'll be right back.
Swing state of Georgia knows the truth. I think they know that the former president is a schemer, because if that weren't the case, they wouldn't have won 2 Democratic Senate seats.
Prior to Biden's dropout, I was really discouraged by my options. I know how important it is, as a Black person, for me to vote, but I have more optimism now in the light of Kamala.
As a black woman, I can't help but be excited for Kamala.
Welcome back to Battleground. Georgia voters there on the importance of their state in this election. And given how close Georgia is likely to be once again this year, changing demographics could help us predict how the race plays out there. Consider this, about 195,000 Latinos are expected to cast ballots in Georgia this November, which is an increase of over 20% since 2016. That's a huge number when you consider that Joe Biden carried the state 4 years ago by less than 12,000 votes. For more on the race in Georgia, I'm pleased to be joined by Phoebe Quinton, politics data reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Phoebe, good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's start with that stat we just showed about the increase of Latino voters in Georgia from 2016 to now, more than 20%. In just 8 years, what impact is this having on elections in Georgia?
Across the board, we saw an increase in the number of voters from 2016 to 2020. That's true for all demographic groups. What's interesting about Latino voters in the state is that it's not just the number of voters that are increasing, but their share of the electorate, meaning that out of all of the voters in the state, there were a higher percentage of Latino voters in 2020 than there were in 2016. And that's not just true for Latinos. We also saw an increase in Asian American voters participating in Georgia's elections as well. Overall, we're seeing that Georgia's electorate is becoming more diverse, and that some of these smaller voting blocs are having a bigger say in Georgia's elections.
Interesting. Okay, I wanted to read something that you wrote recently and get you to drill down a little for us. You said, since the 2008 presidential election, more Hispanic and Asian American voters have been participating in elections. In 2008, the two groups made up roughly 2% of those voters. In 2020, that share had grown to 5%. Explain why that's so significant.
So these may seem like minuscule percentage points, but they really come into play in a competitive state like Georgia. That increase from 2% to 5% is an increase in almost 200,000 voters in the state. In the 2020 election, we saw that Joe Biden won with less than 0.3% more than Donald Trump, which is just less than 12,000 votes. Through my reporting at the AJC, I found that these seemingly small shifts can make a real difference in Georgia's elections.
Yeah, clearly we remember 2020. Okay, finally, Phoebe, Republicans are still very strong in Georgia. What do these changing demographics mean for their strategy when it comes to putting together winning coalitions?
Although research shows that Hispanic and Asian American voters lean Democratic, their votes are not guaranteed for the party. So for Republican campaigns, this means that they're likely to start reaching out more to these voters and try and win over their votes for future elections. Based on the political scientists that I've spoken with, they think that Republican campaigns will begin increasingly reaching out more to try and win over these voters because they can, as I've said before, impact the elections.
Well, they'd be very smart to, that's for sure. Okay, Phoebe Quinton with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks so much for crunching those numbers.
Thanks for having me.
For more on all of this, visit us at battlegroundnews.com or click on the QR code here. You can sign up for our newsletter, download our interactive swing state map, and find our social media links. And if you miss an episode, that's all right. You can catch up on YouTube or through our podcast. Up next, a look at the latest electoral map for some clues about where this race stands and which swing states remain too tight to call. Battleground, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Battleground. We're now here 5 days a week, tracking the fight for the 270 electoral votes needed to win this election. So let's get right to the latest numbers and see where things stand. And thanks as always to our friends at 270 to Win for their awesome maps. Okay, here we go. These numbers are based on an aggregate of polling from the Cupp political report. And before we get to the 93 electoral votes up for grabs in our 7 swing states, here's a reminder that our pre-swing state baseline is Harris 226, Trump 219. Okay, something I almost never say. Let's have fun with math. In Arizona, according to the folks at Cupp Political Report, Kamala Harris is now leading by a small margin. So we'll give her the state's 11 electoral votes. That puts her up 237 to 219. Last week, we had Trump up narrowly there. In Georgia, the race is too close to call. So for this exercise, neither candidate will get Georgia's 16 electoral votes. And we stay at 237 to 219. Kamala Harris now also leads in Michigan, another one of the biggest prizes on election night, moving her total to 252. To North Carolina now, and perhaps the most surprising result this week, after weeks and months of Trump leading in the Tar Heel state, the Cook Political Report has Harris with a slight lead, which would put her on the doorstep of 270. Donald Trump is still leading in Nevada, which adds 6 more votes to his tally, so 268 to 225. And here in Pennsylvania, Harris still holds a narrow lead. If that were the case on an election night, that would put her at well over 270 electoral votes, enough to become our next president. And finally, in Wisconsin, a state the Democrats lost in 2016 but flipped in 2020, new polling shows Harris up there slightly, but within the margin of error. That would make the final electoral vote count 297 to 225. Still plenty of time left for this race to change, and as we've learned from covering Donald Trump, you can never count him out. Okay, that's enough math for me, as always. But to help put these numbers into context, I'm pleased to be joined by Samara Klar, professor of political science at the University of Arizona. Samara, good to have you here.
My pleasure. Nice to see you.
Okay, let's start with Arizona. Obviously, the race is still very tight there. But what's your sense of how this race has changed with Harris instead of Biden at the top?
Well, we've obviously seen a little bit of a shift in the polls in Arizona and elsewhere. Before Biden stepped aside, Trump had fairly consistent, granted fairly small, yet consistent, often outside of the margin of error leads in polling. And Harris has eradicated those leads. Now what we're seeing is mostly too close to call within the margin of error, sort of razor thin polling here in Arizona.
And so many of the swing state polls we talk about here, Samara, are so tight, just like Arizona, certainly within the margin of error. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves and our viewers not to get overly optimistic or pessimistic, because polls can change. They're a snapshot, they're a moment in time, but they can change, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, what a poll is telling us is what people think today. And what we're asking of polls when we look at forecasting is who is actually going to vote. So that's sort of a predictive behavioral measure. If I were to say, who does everyone like today in America, a poll can do a pretty great job of telling me that. But if I'm going to ask a pollster, okay, well, predict who's actually going to show up, who's actually going to mail in their ballot, that's where things get very tricky.
Another one of the things we've talked a lot about on this show is the changing demographics of North Carolina. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, North Carolina is a really fascinating state because it has consistently voted for Republican candidates since the 70s. I mean, it's very unusual for North Carolina to support a Democratic candidate in a presidential election, but Republicans are winning by extremely narrow margins. So we're talking like 1 percentage point, 1 or 2 percentage points. And that's what makes North Carolina a swing state. North Carolina doesn't really swing back and forth election cycle to election cycle, but the election outcomes are so tight.
Yeah, I mean, Kamala Harris feels very good in North Carolina. That state is in play now. She's opened 25 or so offices in the state. That gives you an indication of how seriously they're taking North Carolina. But finally, we of course know Donald Trump won Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania in 2016, but then he lost all 3 to Joe Biden 4 years ago. What makes these 3 states more of a block, and why are they so critical to whoever wins this race?
Well, you know, these 3 states we think about, the Rust Belt, the Upper Midwest, these are states that have similar demographics across state. They have similar issues, similar industries, a similar history of industries and industries closing. So candidates can sort of come out to these states with one unified campaign message. I would argue Tim Walz was largely a choice made to appeal to voters in the Upper Midwest, and that's what he's doing. That's his mission. I mean, he's Project Midwest, and I think he's out there trying to get that assignment done.
Samara Klar from University of Arizona, thanks so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great to see you.
Okay, up next, a look at how Tim Walz will make his appeal to swing state voters in Chicago tomorrow night, and hear how people are reacting to Walz online. At Firefly Scout says Tim Walz is a golden retriever, just so likable. And at Ziad Asali says the United States has a vice president who is a first-class communicator. Battleground will be right back.
Tim Walz is a Midwestern dad. Walz has a history of service of over 20 years. He's a public school teacher, and he's an avid hunter. And coming from a rural community, that really resonates.
I think it's a strategic move. He's a Midwesterner. A lot of these battleground states are in the Midwest.
Authentic. And he is very authentic. That's a good word.
I definitely support Walz more than her.
He reminds me of my dad.
Welcome back to Battleground. Those were swing state voters weighing in with their thoughts about Governor Tim Walz. Tomorrow night in Chicago, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz gets his chance to showcase why Kamala Harris chose him to be her wingman, including what Democrats hope is his appeal to voters in battleground Wisconsin and Michigan. Sam Woodward of USA Today has been covering Governor Walz as much as any reporter in the country and now joins us from Chicago at the DNC. Sam, good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, most of us do not know Tim Walz from a hole in the wall, but you've been covering him for a while now. What has made him such an effective politician in Minnesota? Let's start there.
I think you heard it exactly from those voters, the way that it really is. One of those voters used the word authentic. Yeah. I hear that every single day when I'm talking with people, not only in Minnesota, but people that have no idea who he is. I'm sure you've seen it on social media, those memes basically describing him as the Midwestern dad. As someone that's covered him and someone that knows people that know him very closely, that is very accurate. One of the things that I've chatted with voters, specifically in Minnesota, is they feel very apathetic about the Democratic Party, this idea of elitism. And a lot of people weren't excited about Kamala Harris, specifically because she didn't resonate with them. You know, maybe the policies did that she pushes through the Biden administration, but it's about being the right messenger. And as a Midwesterner, being able to chat with someone and believe in someone that is an avid hunter, someone that comes from a rural conservative district in southern Minnesota, is probably going to appeal to you a little bit more than an ex-prosecutor in California.
Yeah, there's a lot of country between the coasts. It's nice to have, you know, someone on the ticket who can talk to those people. We know he grew up in a very small town in Nebraska, and a big part of his pitch tomorrow night in Chicago is to voters in our swing states of Wisconsin and Michigan. What, to your mind, is his appeal and his pitch to voters there, not Minnesota, but neighboring-ish states?
Absolutely. Across the USA Today network, our reporters have the opportunity to talk with these very people. And I've spoken with people both in Wisconsin and Michigan that really embrace this idea of duality. You do not have to be a bleeding heart liberal to push for progressive policies. You do not have to dye your hair and fit the ideal mold of what a liberal should look like, because Tim Walz doesn't fit that. You know, he shows up to conferences and press conferences wearing camo and just having come out from, you know, he looks like a real worker. When I speak with voters, that really resonates with them.
Yeah, there's a video floating around where he's sort of making fun of his daughter's vegetarianism. He calls turkey a vegetable in Minnesota. Okay, Minnesota, as you know, it can be more progressive at times on a range of issues, and Republicans have certainly tried to tag Tim Walz as too progressive. How has he walked that line in Minnesota, which has plenty of conservative voters as well?
One of the things that is a common misconception about the state is that it is safely blue. That's not true. Yeah. It is a very close call state. We haven't voted for a Republican for president since, you know, the 1970s. I mean, that's crazy. So I think it's really easy to overlook it for a lot of reasons, considering it flyover country, but looking at it as blue. And within Minnesota specifically, I mean, he had to win 6 elections in the southernmost district in the state. And that district has consistently voted for Republicans and specifically voted for Trump. So you have to look at his campaigning and how he approaches talking with rural voters. He was on the Ag Committee winning Congress, as well as the Veterans Affairs Committee. So going back to this idea of duality, being able to be a progressive and appeal to these people in these conservative districts, even if you aren't conservative. I mean, it really, when I speak with voters, it's almost a superpower of being able to exhibit this personality that you would like to see in office, and know and or hope that they are able to work across party lines. When he first joined office in 2018, he was working with a split House and Senate. He did not have a Democratic trifecta. That being said, that was also during the pandemic, as well as the riots and protests following the murder of George Floyd. And he was still able to push not necessarily progressive policies, but policies that affected the moment directly, with bipartisan support and his ability to talk with Republicans and, you know, be a person beyond a politician is what I hear from people that have spoken with him, is that they were able to pass police training restrictions and action restrictions, specifically when it comes to use of force. And that was massive in the state. That was something that everyone cared about. So beyond that, there is now a Democratic trifecta. In 2023, the Minnesota legislature put through massive policy pushes. So whether that be granting driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants, or re-enfranchising felon rights, voting rights, to the child tax credit. He's continued to win re-election and still appeals to conservatives, maybe not on policy, but personality.
Sam Woodward with USA Today. Great stuff. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Essie.
That's it for now. I'm Essie Cupp. See you next time here on Battleground.